Good afternoon and welcome to the session on travel risk management, part of the Standards Makers Forum for BSI. I'm joined today with Dr. Russell Price. Before I turn you over to Russell, I'm going to have 10 minutes of your time just to run through a few things. First is, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit those questions via the Q&A, and we'll address those towards the end of the session. It's 45 minutes. So let's see the next slide here. BSI, British Standards Institution, is the oldest national standards body in the world. This photo shows the founders of BSI Group. It began with the Engineering Standards Committee and in London. And it was founded by Sir John Wolfe-Barry, the same man who designed London's Tower Bridge. BSI has gone through a number of changes, but importantly, in 1929, it received the Royal Charter. And another important change was in 1998, there was a revision in the charter that enabled the organization to diversify so that it could acquire other businesses, and the name was changed to the BSI Group. You see in the right-hand corner of this slide is the kite mark. This was first registered in 1903 and is recognized by 82% of the UK population. BSI is not part of government, not part of the UK government. It does work closely with the government, though, and the government departments in order to further the public interest, especially with BAYS. So on to the topic, 3103, or travel risk management. This slide really gives you a very quick snapshot of the standard, because Russell's really going to go into the detail of it. But just to introduce it, the scope for any standard usually sums it up entirely. So in this case, it is the guidance to organizations on how to manage the risks to the organizations as well as to the travelers as a result of undertaking the travel. So it does provide a structured approach, and by that it means that there's many of the people who are attending or listening in will be familiar with the Plan, Do, Check Act or the high-level structure. But there has to be some means of structuring the document. And this one more or less follows the high-level structure, but with a bit of the PDCA in there. But it's not a management system. I think it's the key thing. But it's guidance. But it doesn't look at the elements of the policy, how to develop a program for travel risk management, looking at your threats and hazard identification, doing your risk assessment, and then the prevention and mitigation strategies. It follows up with review and communication and reporting, part of that continual improvement aspect of the PDCA. An interesting thing is some of the definitions. Now, these definitions, before I forget, they're available on the ISO site as well as the BSI site you get a preview. So you don't have to buy the standard. When you look for the standard, especially with the ISO, you can really get quite a lot in terms of the free preview for the introduction, as well as the terms and definitions. And in this case, I think it is kind of important to see how they are defining things. It may seem brutally obvious what travel is, but in this case, it's not just a movement of a person, but it's on behalf of the organization, and that comes within the organization's duty of care. So those organization, what is an organization? Is it a business, or how big is a business? All types and sizes of organizations defines those things, but it also defines duty of care. So we've got the terminology there, as well as a structured approach to travel risk management. And then it ends with the annexes. Then there's some very useful annexes. One of the questions was whether it includes information regarding the pandemic. That came up during the development of the standard at ISO. I will say that because standards are usually structured so that they're not prescriptive and they fit generally, and not relating to a particular specific anything. That's the beauty of a standard. It's a common way of doing things. That the pandemic is noted. It would have seen as serious omission at that point. So there's an annex there that does include some additional guidance. But the standard itself already encompassed the elements of what to do during pandemic or war, natural disasters, or any kind of catastrophe or crisis. So to finish up and to introduce Russell, but the standard is an agreed, repeatable way of doing things. It's a guidance standard. I have to give credit to International SOS, who sponsored the PAS 3001 that really helped to introduce the concept. There were other sources that helped to put the topic of travel risk on the table for ISO to create a standard. It was a BSI submission, by the way, but it published in September 2021. And the one thing I would say is if you're interested in doing standards, please do look at this, Google, become a standards maker, get involved. You'll be able to see the benefits, the roles, the responsibilities, but you just Google that site and there's a wealth of information there. It's free to participate as a BSI committee member, and it's very rewarding. Most people will genuinely say it's very, very rewarding. I'm the secretary. If you had any questions, want to contact me about this risk management area, or perhaps others, I do a few other areas, but contact me. I give credit to the TC, the ISO TC chair, that's Kevin Myers, and the national committee chair, Kai Boschman. They were incredibly active in their leadership and enabling the document to be published, and as well as it has been. But I also need to give credit to the chairman of the Risk Management Committee, just largely, and this is Russell Price, Dr. Russell Price. And Russell, this is your cue. I'm going to stop sharing and introduce you now. Oh no, I'm sorry, I'm doing the share of your slide, sorry. So I will introduce Russell. Now Russell's about to take, but I wanted to say that Russell brings a unique perspective to risk, continuity, and resilience management, and it's based on a breadth and depth of experience across multiple sectors. He's been at the forefront of development across risk, business continuity, and resilience fields for 20 years. And he continues to lead industry thinking and professional practice in these areas. Russell is an advisor to governments, regulators, and businesses on the management of risk. He's the chair of the Risk Management Committee, RM1, to the BSI, and he's a member of other committees, including continuity and resilience, governance, societal security, the information security committees. Is very much an active and valued committee member, so we appreciate that. He's been awarded the Industry Personality of the Year, and in November 2018 was presented by BSI with the Leadership Award for his outstanding contribution to risk management. Russell's a leading contributor to the international work to improve risk and resilience management, engaging businesses and public sector leaders on the importance of changing organizational thinking and focusing on risk management that enhances organizational resilience to deliver positive change. In his spare time, when he gets a bit of that, Russell is a motorcycle enthusiast and loves rugby. Over to you, Russell.
These things are always slightly embarrassing, but there's the sign of a misspent youth, and I think I'm paying my penance by doing this work in standards. You know, the risk management area is often misunderstood. It's not about form filling. It's about creating the kind of positive changes that have real value. In Dave's introduction, you saw the rich history of BSI going back 120 years. And all the way through, what the BSI has done has helped make the world a little bit safer, a little bit better at every step. And whether or not it's those measures that come in that makes the toys for our children safe, our railways, I was going to say reliable, but I'm in England, so we'll avoid the railways for a second. But all the way through, there is this trust in the kite mark, in the name and the brand of BSI. And when you're talking about risk, the UK and the BSI and ISO have really taken huge strides over the past 15 years through the introduction of an international standard for risk management. Now, that is the TC262 committee. And The principles that are in 31,000 are really about performance. They're really about creating some very positive effects that make the work that's done safer, that manage the performance, that ensure that our objectives are met in a very uncertain world. And I don't think anyone can deny that today the world is very uncertain. There are lots of things that can happen, both good and bad. And it is, I think, incumbent on us to always look to find those areas where we can exert influence to continue working on the principles of safety, security, and value preservation and expansion. Now, with that in mind, one of the things that we, I suppose, for many years took for granted was how we travel. I've certainly been guilty of throwing a weekend bag in the back of the car, driving to the airport and flying off to some location to enjoy myself. And that's perfectly fine. But in business, where you have a duty of care, perhaps a little bit more responsibility needs to be thought about. And certainly today, with the complexities that we see, with globalization, with a lot of disparities in the way things work internationally, just taking potluck and taking a quick flight somewhere might be okay, but it also might not. Dave, could we have the next slide? Could we have the next slide, Dave? One of the things that has been done in industry for a number of years now is to think about travel really in the context of a travel risk program. And they haven't used the word risk. The word has been travel management. It's you've got an in-house booking system. You'll work with a local travel services provider. You might have an account with an airline. There are lots of different options there. But there hasn't been a top-down view. Now, this has been evolving over the past sort of 10 years as some of those global complexities have started kicking in. And folks have realized that there is a range of threats. And it's not just about headline threats, for example, with terrorism. It can be travel disruption for weather issues. I can remember being stuck in Mexico because of a volcano in Iceland with a completely unpronounceable name. Those things interrupt business and they also introduce risks. I've been traveling and needed some medical interventions, and luckily I had the provisions in place to see me safe and sound and return to my family. But for many folks, they don't have that. And more importantly, their organizations have not thought about that, incurring a liability under law that can then be pursued. This standard focuses on a duty of care. It looks at the obligations that an employer has, and it can be used by others as well, but it looks at what should be done in order to be a responsible employer or to deliver services in a responsible way. I was doing some work the other day and I drew up a list of the criteria for a 5-star hotel. In drawing up that list, I thought it was really interesting that after looking at all the wonderful areas around linen, chocolates, hospitality, concierge, I got to the bottom and there was not one mention of security. Now that is an interesting perspective. We are judging quality without considering safety and security. Is that right? Is it encompassing just the physical security or information security? If you're traveling for business, you might be logging onto your corporate network from a hotel and finding yourself suffering a man-in-the-middle attack, something like that in the IT space that means there is now a risk to your corporate networks. And indeed, there are many, many, many examples of senior executive systems being exploited as they travel. So here we have this context of shifting from being a tourist and carefree and now being in the world of business and having responsibilities, both legal responsibilities, but also a responsibility back to our organization. So there's a shared account that needs to be thought through. Now, rather than ask people to come up with their solutions in an ad hoc basis, the decision was taken 4 years ago to develop an all-encompassing travel risk management standard, ISO 31030, and it was published in September. What it does is it takes a four-step approach where effectively we ask the right questions. We integrate it with the operations of the organization in a way that is designed to extract value. This is not about adding cost, it's about creating value. It can fit into almost any existing management system for risk or indeed other areas because it's complementary. But critically in this space, it can stand on its own. So if an organization does not have a corporate risk management or an enterprise risk management process in place, it can fit in to that organization's working practices as well. We spent a lot of time working with industry, the kind of people and organizations that are managing the arrangements for travel for their organizations on a daily basis. We had representation from professional bodies. There was a huge amount of discussion with specialists around what good looks like. And in moving from understanding the context to understanding what can happen, what you see in the travel risk management process, the yellow box on the screen, we were able to catch an awful lot of the variations that have caught people out in the past. And that covered not just medical and security issues, but issues that are perhaps quite current and thematic at the moment in society. Things like LGBT plus issues. How can you not be conscious of those in the modern world? We've got a responsibility to look after our people in the broad round of well-being. And we've included those. We've also looked at how journey and operational management can work, section 3 of the standard in this bubble chart, which looks at how we might be able to improve the experience for the traveller, letting them know that they've got support and resources available when necessary, introducing some of the new technology that exists. And there's been a lot of innovation in the travel sector through the use of apps and smart devices that adds a capability that didn't exist before. And we've tapped into this with the crafting of this standard. And what it gives is an ability to adapt and flex in ways that can meet and overcome challenges that in the past might have left us stuck at an airport, at the side of the road, or, God forbid, be the victim of far worse situations. We also look to make sure that we exploit value in terms of cost and efficiencies. And it's very important, I think, to share information, both at the organizational and operational level, understanding what's going wrong and fixing things before they become critical. And that's very important to the business traveler because early indications of issues, if we can head them off, can save us a lot of time and money. And in this context, the personal harm that can be associated with this. And an example of that is a rise in assaults in some countries being picked up at an operational level and having perhaps action to change security or booking procedures to move those folks that are vulnerable to safer places and do this early on rather than suffer the consequences later. Dave, if we could have the next slide. At the moment, this standard is a Type B, and there is, as most of you will know, being involved in standards, guidance that is complementary and relevant to the travel sector. For those of you with deep experience of other standards, we have really worked hard to integrate this standard into the culture and habit of practitioners in this area. So we've got the support of many of the professional bodies. There were tremendously valuable meetings and focus groups held, changing some of the terminology, developing some of the thinking, so that whilst it can be self-assessed at the operational level, even audited, we felt as though there wasn't that maturity and experience of standards application in the travel sector to really go for certification. But I'll come to that in a second with some news towards the end of the presentation. But actually, the standard itself can be referenced by all the other standards where business travel occurs. You've got a robust framework that's consistent and supports the kind of activities that folks can find themselves involved in. And we see it very much as a tool that connects and amplifies the value of standards usage, whether they be management systems or those guidance standards in an area which we all are involved in one way, shape or form. I'm sure you, like me, are looking forward to getting back to traveling for business far more regularly. But I think there's an expectation today that we will be a lot more responsible. Certainly my phone has my COVID passport apps on it. There's those requirements being introduced, not just to get into countries, but to get into buildings, to work and develop the kind of opportunities that we want to exploit at the global level. And just looking across the spread of health risks that we'll be able to manage through this more efficiently, there are going to be tremendous benefits. Dave, if I could have the next slide, please. Back one. Putting this into context, a lot of standards focus on very discrete areas of activity. And it's quite rare that a standard actually hits everyone, everywhere, all of the time. And what we have with ISO 31030 is a standard that cuts into how we work around the world and changes quite clearly the actions and behaviors that you might see as risky or might be found to be risky. It gives a credibility for conversations and consistency in all of the ISO countries. And one of the things that I think we've seen coming out of COVID is a recognition by not just governments, but by business generally, that there is a new accountability for safety and security when traveling for business. Now, this is going to work through and be a new normal for us. And the timing, we didn't know COVID was going to happen, but certainly once the crisis started to emerge, what became very clear was that we had the mechanism here to get back the confidence to go to work around the world. And for me, one of the things that I took on board very early on was that there is an issue of ownership. There is an issue of feeling as though the right thing has to be done, not for standards, but for the user. Does it answer the questions? Does it meet the needs of the small company, the large company, the government, the service providers? And as we've gone through this process of developing the standard, we've had the reality checks, we've had the workshops. I hesitate to use the word universal approval, but actually there's been no technical criticism that I have seen. And I have done dozens and dozens of launch events and sessions related to this standard. And the message coming back is saying, this is great, with the follow-on being, and it's long overdue. And that combination gives me great confidence going forward that the contents of the standard is going to achieve its primary goal, engaging with the users and creating that positive change. Dave, could we have the next slide? Every organization is a little different though. And one of the really nice things about the standard is its structure. It mirrors normal working, but it also steers the thinking in quite an agile way. It gives you the big picture, but it also gives you the actionable information that you need in each of the areas of activities that are relevant to the employer, that duty of care stakeholder. But what it also does is, through that structure, is give those people that are part of that, either as service providers, other stakeholders, with the ability to apply the parts that are relevant to them discreetly. Now, this is giving you an amplification of benefit, because at the moment, and certainly for many years, there has been inconsistencies in how the industry has judged itself. So the way in which one organization might represent its five-star service would be different depending on which scheme they were part of. There were different benchmarks. By introducing 31,030, what we're able to do is to deliver a level of consistency across the topics identified and spoken to in some detail in a way that has not previously existed. And the enthusiastic reception that we've had from the industry in this area has been really quite startling. And anyone working in standards seeing this would be, perhaps like me, somewhat surprised at the enthusiasm from folks who are going to have to evolve their thinking, saying, at last, now we've got something we can trust, which again goes back to those fundamental principles of what standards are here to do. Now, having that framework is all well and good, but it's got to deliver on the ground some of those value equation things that we spoke about just briefly. Dave, could we go to the next slide? When you're looking at this, to sort of sum up the simple value, the simple returns, undoubtedly it is going to improve travel-related health, safety, and security. Simple. The attention to detail, asking the intelligent questions of an informed traveler is going to change outputs. The output being they come back safer, secure, far more often. Those that end up in situations where there might be a medical emergency, there'll be information available and support resources to respond quickly and appropriately, not just delivering care to the traveler, the victim, but also reassuring friends, family, and building that trust and relationship between employees and employers. Something that can't be underestimated in a post-COVID world. That's a very important element of this. It isn't structured just in the sense of moving people around the world. It thinks about the stakeholders and the engagement with broader business. So we're looking at including things like information, the kind of legal and financial exposures that might exist that might otherwise be completely omitted. And in a world where intellectual property and information security is so important, the inclusion of that really does ensure that the other systems, the other standards that are in place that are there to preserve the integrity are met when people are traveling. How often do the C-suite travel with a briefcase filled with material that might represent the whole value of your company? Certainly if you're not on the markets and you're going to for an IPO, something like that, it can be hugely important. You don't want to lose it. When you're looking at how we can develop our commercial activities, sometimes we're going to have to travel to places that might not be as safe and secure as the beautiful Somerset sunshine that I'm sitting in at the moment. It might be a little bit more hazardous, and we can't ask people to go and travel and work in these spaces without consideration of those risk factors. Now, it is not just about criminal acts and those sort of things. It can be health concerns, those other issues. And as business grows, being able to respond to the needs of markets in the context that they present consistently and safely is an enabler. It's a competitive advantage. And it also enables folks to level up. When you wrap all of those things in, increasing that safety and stability, ensuring that there is connected thinking, what you're doing is arguing for a lot of commercial value. But there's one more, and Dave's jumped forward, but I want to cover the one at the bottom there. Just in the past week or so, COP26 has finished. Traveling for business is an issue when it comes to sustainability. Understanding the obligations and what is likely to be an increasingly monitored space, being able to justify transportation, movement of people, the substitution of travel for Zoom conferences looking at where things are happening and how the big picture evolves is going to be important. And this standard speaks to those areas as well. So you will know CO2 levels, what the options might be from the perspective and through the lens of sustainability and the UN SDG goals as well. And that includes those aspects around human rights and so on and so forth. Thank you. Dave, next one. You know, up till now, there really has been poor understanding at the travel risk space about what the obligations are around health and security. And for most instances, the duty of care really wasn't being met. And if there's any doubt about that, one should look at the court cases that have been progressing just in the UK in this space. Frequently, areas that could have and should have been managed were not. And that led to events that people then pursue, sometimes for very many years, trying to get a form of justice, when in fact that should have been substituted for better competence. So this standard gives both the insight and that guidance on competence to ensure safer, better travel outcomes. Now that reinforces business confidence. It enables us to get back, and 31,030 gives us a capability to transform what is being done. But there is still an outstanding issue. One of the issues is this aspect of assurance. Dave, next slide. The guidance provided by ISO 31030 is in the form of a Type B standard. There is no official certification. Last week, in conjunction with David Bell of the BSI, I was able to let our global audience know that the RM1 Committee for Risk Management in the UK has formally approved the development of another standard, but this time a certification standard. This standard is intended for service providers, because whilst we have created this expectation on employers to understand their duty of care, as part of that, they need to be able to trust their service providers across the whole area of ground transportation, related services, venues, accommodation providers. And this is not just hotels. This is the kind of economy that's provided by those providers of business apartments, the sort of Airbnb type space as well, that is changing the travel sector. Working with the industry bodies, there's been a lot of encouragement for us to create a certification standard. The work is done. RM16 has been formed. And over the next couple of months, we are laying in place the last pieces of the puzzle to start work in 2022 to fast track the development of a certification standard. And taken together, 31,030 will deliver that understanding internationally of what should be expected if you're going to fulfill your duty of care. That's one side of the coin. On the other side of the coin, there will be a certification from BSI available so that people can trust them, so that the providers of those services are living up to the promises that are sometimes being made but not kept in the sector at the moment. And it is great to see such resounding support from those industry stakeholders, the practitioners, the companies that deliver these services, because they know that they can do better and want to. That we hope that standard can be delivered in less than 2 years, and we will probably be out for our first big public consultation in the first quarter of 2023. And if we're really slick, we might have it out by the end of the summer of 2023. So that sort of pretty much rounds me up, Dave. And I'd like to thank you and everyone for indulging me for so very long, and perhaps time for some questions.
Right. Well, Richard Jones has put a question for us, and he has suggesting, appreciating this is about principles, given the current global challenges, should the following be covered? One, let's take them. There's just a few here. The degradation of skills, such as driving skills, as a result of prolonged lockdowns. Two, I might actually rattle them off, are kind of related. Fatigue is a result of long COVID, or sleep deprivation and its adverse effect on judgment. And three, should risk to the environment from travel, increased carbon footprint also
Yeah.
be considered? Hmm.
It's interesting. You're really holding my feet to the fire there, Richard, because I made that bold claim about thinking outside of the box and going beyond the simple and perhaps dealing with some of the complex. And you might guess from my confidence in my response, yes, we have thought about that. It would fall under the well-being aspects. There is undoubtedly stresses on us all when we travel. There are factors that need to be thought about. And in the context of a business traveler today, there is a need for organizations to appreciate how contributing factors may affect that individual. And our approach has been to reverse the perspective and make it traveler centric. Now, by doing that, we are introducing and maintaining a focus on well-being. And we have to choose that expression because of those technical issues around how it's understood around the world and so on. But it would be, to use one of the examples that came up in our conversations in committee, when we're looking at this, I've certainly had schedules where in a week or two, I've been on 3 different continents, been in airplanes at 30,000 feet plus for 5 or 6 days and been expected to do a week's worth of work in a week, but with all those other factors. And that's not a good use of the resources that I might be able to deliver because it burns you out. So when you're looking at things like fatigue, sleep deprivation, follow-on effects from illness, that it is called out in the standard. It is saying you've got to take a view on it. Because people are different and approaching it from the perspective of well-being, there is greater choice and flexibility for the traveler and the employer business to work out what is right for that individual. We can't prescribe it because the variety of conditions and situations are just too broad. But establishing this as a valid and important area for conversation and agreement is included and would cover all of the points that you've raised.
Okay. Russell, in your opinion, how does this standard 31030 fit with other guidance that could be legislation or government guidelines, especially in terms of now perhaps with the pandemic? How does it marry up with it? Does it complement it? Does it contradict it? Is it missing something, the COVID passports? Or how do you think it fits with
No, I think there's, one's always dangerous when you're doing recorded meetings of being called out in 6 months for something that's
with that
changed.
Caveat.
So I'll caveat this so it's in the recording. At the time of recording, what I think you see is an incredible consistency between what good looks like in 2021 in the last quarter with the factors that business need to consider. Following the guidance as it's written will give pretty much every business, if it's done with a bit of integrity and honesty, pretty much answer all of the questions that can be reasonably asked. We have not and specifically exclude the very high risk red zone type scenarios. This is where, for example, news reporters might be in frontline areas in dangerous countries, where there might be Ebola outbreaks in parts of countries. We've excluded those for obvious reasons, because they're exceptional and need to be treated as such. But for most mainstream activities, it is comprehensive enough to clearly demonstrate to any third party, and that third party can be the traveler, it can be the traveler's family, it could be the court, it could be a supplier, that actually what's being asked is reasonable. It's asking reasonable questions that should be communicated if people are being responsible. And that's why I think it's so easy to see how trust can be built through this standard. It is onerous only in so much as it asks people to live up to the promises that have maybe been made but not delivered on across this sector.
Yeah, I think that's right, because in the development of the standard, there were some pretty large organizations represented, and those people representing the organizations were responsible for the travel of their employees. And I think they were wholeheartedly endorsing, what was finally produced in 31030. I'm not quite sure about legislation, though, to be honest with you. I'm not sure how it marries up with, not only British legislation, but because British standards are often used internationally. How.
Yeah. Well, I can speak to legislation at the moment. There are, as I mentioned, there's plenty of court cases in this space, and I'm actually an expert in one of the court cases being called before the High Court. And certainly, I think if the principles that are outlined in 31,030 had been in place before this situation developed, then there would have been no need for the court case. None at all. Because it is that ambiguity that's the problem. If you've not asked the questions, if there isn't the clarity of communication, if there's perhaps a sense that the right thing hasn't been done, then it all too often leads to lawyers getting involved, and that's where legislation plays its part. By leveling the field and saying this is the situation, everybody's making informed decisions, and that's the way we can move forward with this. It solves the problem before anything's happened. And that's why I think the power and value of this standard is its ability to intervene before anything adverse has occurred. It manages positive change very early on in the cycle. And what you're left with are, there will still be problems. People will still have heart attacks. There will still be muggings. There will still, I'm sorry to say it, be terrorist incidents. But the ability to manage in those situations will be supported by more considered thinking, more focus on support resources that will be needed, and an integration with things like crisis management, planning, incident management, all those things that are covered by other standards. And that's where I think real value can occur. But I can see we've just got a time warning, Dave, so I'm going to cut it short.
Yeah, we do. So, I mean, there was an interesting question regarding whether minors or those accompanying travelers are included in consideration as part of the standard.
I can smile and answer quickly. Yes, they are. I've taken my son on business trips. I hope that you'll have the chance to do that in the future. It's great to be able to do it. And yes, it's included. We also had to perpetuate something horrific, though, and that is a piece of jargon, a word that I hate. It's called bleisure. Bleisure is where you mix business and leisure travel. It does go into a lot of detail, as I've said, but most scenarios, traveling with minors and maybe going to Geneva for business and then hopping on the train to go skiing for yourself, that's all there.
Yeah, making the distinction again with the terminology between personal time and off-duty time. So that's where the terminology becomes quite important.
Absolutely right. And it's that clarity again, Dave. It means that when you've got maybe a life-changing injury from your exploits on the skis, and believe me, I'm never going on skis again. It's not a natural environment for me. Having that means that insurance that might apply is no longer a minefield. It's actually understood and proper measures can be put in place. And that's how you get better service and better positive change out of the whole process.
All right, brilliant. Well, nice note to end on. So Russell, thank you as always. And thanks for those people listening now and perhaps in the future for their recordings. And I wish everybody a very good day.
As always, folks, lovely to be able to speak with you. If you've got any questions, just reach out and we'll be happy to help. Thank you.
Bye-bye.